Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah, and if this is your first time tuning in to this podcast, I welcome you, and I hope that you'll come back for future episodes if you like what you see today or hear today if you're listening. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, I welcome you back. And I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So before we get into the main event, people, please make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can get future notifications on episodes of the Identity Talk for Educators Live podcast, as well as our newest podcast, Radical Math Talk, right here on the Identity Talk channel on YouTube. We're also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other platforms where you listen to your podcast. So make sure you subscribe there as well. And if you are someone who likes to help contribute to the foundation of this platform and help us continue to build it, we do accept donations, no matter how small or how big they are. We accept them all and we appreciate them and don't take them for granted. You can find us on Cash App at money sign IDTALK4ED and on Venmo at Kwame SM. So that's KWAMESM. And then lastly, you can also learn more about the Identity Talk Consulting website and what we do as far as services at identitytalkforeducators.com. Thank you kindly. So let's talk about what the main thing is today. So today's episode is one that's going to be focused on bilingualism. We're going to be talking about translanguaging. We're going to be talking about just Latinx culture in general. And it's something that personally is a focus for me as I'm still continuing to learn about the different communities in our world. I feel like on this podcast, we've had a lot of guests from other communities across the BIPOC spectrum, whether they're Black, whether they are Asian Pacific Islander, whether they're indigenous. But one thing I've noticed is I still want to learn more about the different Latinx communities in terms of the diversity of the cultures, the diversity within the language, the customs, traditions, and everything else. So today, I want to bring on a good friend of mine who can speak very much in depth about some of those different topics and different things that I really want to explore and really get deeper into. She is a bilingual educator based in New York, and she's just an all-around awesome person. So without further ado, let me bring on Lizette Roman to the podcast to talk with us about her journey and all of the dope work she does within bilingual classrooms. So let's bring Lizette on for this conversation.
Oh, Kwame, thank you so much for having me. It's like really always a pleasure every time you and I have the opportunity to share thoughts and share ideas and
Yeah.
our expertise. I really am honored to be here.
Yes, and it's always great to be in community with you. And this is going back to 2 years ago. 2 years ago when we first met via Instagram.
Isn't that wild? 2 years.
Yeah.
And we keep, well, I know I've reached out to you and you've reached out to me because I think that, and it all comes so
Mhm.
organically. We admire each other's purpose.
Yes.
And I feel strongly what you do and what I do is that it's our life. It's a purpose. We have a passion for it.
For sure. And even if we go 2 months, 4 months, several months without communicating with each other, I know that I'm still following your journey, and I know you're doing the same for me. So the love is always there. And I know that whenever we do connect, it's like we just saw each other yesterday.
For sure. Thank you.
Yes. But let's get right into the conversation because there are a lot of questions I have for you and things that I really want to deep into. So, the first thing is with all our guests is we want to know your journey. How did you get into education and, why do you do what you do? So let's start with that.
Oh my God, that's a deep question.
We
We
starting
can
deep.
go 45 minutes on that. Okay. I'm going to try to make it simple, but I can say this goes back to kind of like what you're trying to learn about. It comes back to my roots.
Hmm.
It comes back to my culture, my foundation. My father had to find refuge in the United States of America and leave his country of Cuba at the young age of 9. Fidel Castro lied to the people of Cuba, turned it into a communist country. And with that, my family had to leave everything behind, waiting 9 years for permission to come here. My grandfather came with 3 children and a wife, having everything taken away from him, and the government took everything away. And so, with that said, when they started a new life here in the United States, the impact on my father was so strong. He came here not speaking a lick of English. And my grandfather, had to start a business, not knowing any English, and they had to adapt to a completely new culture. And the one thing my father always instilled in me and my siblings is something that people cannot take away from you is your faith and your education. And that hit me hard. And my father really he would always tell me, because I've always wanted to be a teacher. Just naturally, I loved working with others and sharing what I know and help. I love to see other people grow. And my father, he would just say how we have to take it all the way. And you're doing something, you have to put all your passion into it. And so I did. And I had all the love and support from my family to become an educator. And, it's been a long journey. I was going through my transcripts, and I've been to 8 different institutions, universities, because I love to continue to grow. And I'm originally from LA. So I went to school. I got my bachelor's and my teaching credentials there. I actually worked in Overtown, Miami, my first year of teaching, which I worked in the all first Black Catholic church and school in Miami, in Overtown. That was my very first class. I still keep in touch with almost all of the students. And then life brought me to New York, where I met my husband. I met my husband actually in Miami. I moved to New York, and I started working at a charter school. And then now I work at a public school. When I was going to start working at the public school, there's just such a demand for bilingual educators because of the demographics. And I was given the support from my current superintendent. Back then, she was the bilingual coordinator, and she said, Lizette, you have to get your bilingual extension. And we'll be able to put you in the classroom with all of our students who are new to the country or are in the bilingual transitional program. And that's what happened. And here I am. And so now I'm doing consulting and I'm teaching at Stony Brook University, and I'm trying to bring awareness about how does the bilingual mind work? What should a bilingual classroom look like? What should a general ed classroom look like that's welcoming students that are new to the country, or a student is born in America but is being raised by parents that speak a different language? So how does all that work, and what can we do to support our students? So yes, that's where I am at.
Yes. And you mentioned the fact that you grew up in LA. So you're first generation,
Yes.
just like I was a first generation immigrant. And I want to talk about that for a little bit. And we're definitely going to touch on the bilingual mind because I think that's a piece that's important for us to really unpack.
Hmm.
But in terms of growing up, being a first generation uh, Cuban American, right?
Yes.
When you were going to school, did you ever have any internal conflict with your identity as that growing up? Uh, did you ever get criticism for speaking Spanish a certain way and not coming from your native country?
This is
Um,
this is such a fascinating question. Like my journey, I just actually gave this assignment to my students at Stony Brook
oh
University,
wow, yeah,
right? Do create a timeline of what your journey has been like throughout the years as a bilingual individual, or somebody that comes like first generation like us, right?
hmm
It's interesting because my parents instilled so much confidence in us to be proud of who we are, where we're from. And my parents were very just go getters. And I think that number one, having that self confidence, the way I saw the world, and my parents were very loving people. You know, we're Catholic Christian and we believe in seeing people for who they are and loving each individual for who they are. That because that's what was taught to me at home. That's how I viewed the world.
all
I
right,
viewed the world with good. And so looking back, I do remember, first of all, where I grew up was in Valencia, where I grew up was Valencia, California. The demographic there, if there were some students of a different ethnic background, it was some Filipinos. We had, if it was any kind of Spanish speaking, it was mostly Mexican Americans.
yeah,
You did not meet many people from South America or Cuba. My mother's from Peru, my father's from Cuba. So, and everyone else was Caucasian, right? And so the way that worked was I remember being in for like fourth grade, and I was always sitting in small group. The teachers were always never the teachers. I'll tell you something. My teachers never made me feel different. I did always have a wonderful experience growing up. I never felt that. I started feeling things different as an adult in the world of education, but as a child, the teachers were very supportive, very inclusive. I never experienced, luckily, I never experienced any of that where I didn't feel I was included. But I do remember sitting in small group and thinking to myself, I don't know any of these vocabulary words because my parents don't use them at home. Like, what is this? Like, I remember just hear like this vocabulary that I was not familiar with. Maybe I heard it in Spanish,
hmm
right? But I wasn't hearing it in English at home. My parents' English was good, but it was not academic. Now their language repertoire in Spanish was phenomenal. They will talk to you about politics, they'll talk about current events, and they'll talk to you about all kinds of things in their native language.
sure.
So um, it was interesting. It was interesting, and I think I answered your question because I can go on a tangent.
Hey, no, this is good because I have a follow up to that. So, your mom's from Peru,
Yes.
your father's from Cuba.
Hmm.
We know that Cuba's in the Caribbean. We know Peru's in South America, right?
Yes.
Different cultures, but
Totally.
yet they speak Spanish in both of those countries. So I'm trying to envision this. You are, let's say, 9-year-old Lizette. You're in the household.
Hmm.
You're hearing your parents speaking Spanish to each other. Are you even cognizant of those differences in the dialects of Spanish? And as someone who learned how to speak Spanish in the household, was that something that helped with your own development? Particularly not just as someone learning, but as someone who's now an educator in a bilingual classroom where I can imagine you have students from different Spanish speaking countries.
That's such an excellent question, Kwame. I do have that advantage. I think that my parents being from two different parts of the world, because South America is very different than
Mhm.
the Caribbean,
Yes.
it most definitely opened my eyes to be worldly. And the conversations often in my family, from both sides of my family, at the dinner table or whatever, were those kinds of conversations that my grandmother, she would joke that, like an avocado, for example, Cubans will call it aguacate, and in Peru, an avocado is palta. And
Mhm.
my Cuban grandmother, would be like, Palta, ¿qué es eso? What's that? You know, like that's not a palta, that's not a word, you know. And she and then my grandmother, she would joke like that. And at the same time, I my father and my mother respected each other's a different they would banter, like joke with each other a lot, but they never put each other's culture down,
Good.
right? They never put each other down. However, it's interesting because each one thinks that they're better than the other. Like the side of the family, you know, like Peruvian side would make fun of my Cuban Like when I speak Spanish, it sounds more like Cuban Spanish,
Okay.
right? So, because we cut off our words a lot at the end and we use a lot of metaphors when we're speaking.
Okay.
And, you know, Peruvians, it was just more like my family, it's just like more like proper Castellano. It's like more like quote unquote proper Spanish. And so they
Mm.
would tease me. But my family, we're a bunch of jokesters. It was all in good love and in nature. And so then, but yes, this opened up my eyes to understand, and also social class. You know, on my mother's side of the family, um, from one part of her family, they were European descent, and specifically Italy. And then then we have another part of my mom's family that, you know, there's some indigenous, and so that's interesting, right?
Right.
That's two totally different cultures. But then it all becomes one. And then with Cuba, my grandmother was my background is from, like, they're all from Spain, Canary Islands, mostly. Um, so, but then my grandfather, see, this is so fascinating. But then, like, my grandfather, they say he used to even like, so he was Christian Catholic, but then, you know, we have the whole Santeria thing, and that,
Yes.
you know, we know the whole history behind this, like Santeria, when they brought in everyone from West Africa, right? How they adapted, right, to their situation. They still wanted to have the religious practices, and Santeria came about. Like my grandfather believed, like he would go and he would pray, and like he would go into the spiritual circles. So it's like interesting, like all these cultures blending in one. And so I was really, those conversations were had. Nothing was ever hidden, you know, and everything was done with a lot of pride. And it made me be helps me be very accepting and understanding of all my students, because
Mhm.
I understand that we are one beautiful mix of people, and respectfully make them feel well. I have to tell you a story because we're
Yes.
kind of like going into it.
Yes.
Most recently, I had a student that came. Maybe I shared this with you. I think, Kwame, last time you and I talked, but I have to talk to her about her because I love her.
Mhm.
Angelina. She came. So now I'm an RTI, bilingual RTI intervention specialist in my building, and the teachers were coming. We need to refer this student. The student is special needs, 100%. She's not talking. She doesn't say anything. She's just staring at us. And I said, okay, let me dig a little deeper here. Let me find out what's going on with this baby. The baby had only been here for less than 6 months,
Mhm.
originally from Ghana. Okay. Most of the students, the demographic in my school district, I want to say we're like 90% Central American. There's no, most of our students either speak English, Spanish, or both. We have two other students that are from West Africa in the entire building out of 1,200 students. So it's like, to me, it's like, yes, now it feels like common sense, but it's also like you're asking me my personal experiences and what I've learned through my education. Right away, I was like, hello, there's no one that speaks her native language that looks like her. There's nothing that we're talking about in the classroom that she can even connect with. Why would she talk to us? She's absorbing everything right now. She's
Right.
she's taking it all in. And so I said, let me work with her for a little bit. So I started working with her kind of one on one. And the way I got this beautiful girl to open up was with what you're telling me. I said to her, "You're from West Africa, from Ghana?" I said, "So that means you eat fufu." And her eyes opened up. She was looking at me like, "How in the world do you even know about fufu?" And I brought out a map, And I pointed to her, look, this is where my family's from. But let me tell you a little bit of history about Cuba. There was one time in Cuba where we had people come from your region of the world, and they brought all the beautiful things. I go, this is why I love to dance salsa. And this is why my two boys are learning to play the conga drums. And this is why in my house, I also eat fufu, because we still call it fufu. And you eat fufu, right? And so plantain was brought to this part of the world because of you, right? And so when I told her that and we connected that way, that was it.
There you go.
Angelina was talking to me, and she is so smart, and she is such a hard worker. And now we talk about everything, anything, but you have to you have to be worldly, and you have to use all those experiences in your personal life and explore, and then touch base and connect with your students and learn about their culture, right? Learn about their culture. You have to know what demographic you're working in and who you're working with. And prior to actually sitting with Angelina, I also researched to learn a little bit about her region of the world before I sat with her. That's do your due diligence for your kids, right?
Yeah, that's key. You just unlocked the door.
Yeah.
And she let you in because you said the right words, you had the right approach.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that I wish I had done. And I told you this off camera. I had a student in my math class who had just come from Dominican Republic
Mm-hmm.
and loved her. I mean, she was a great student. But I only knew but a few words in Spanish,
Uh-huh.
So like all I was doing was, person keep stand up. I'm like, siéntate. That's just me. That was me all day. Like, hey, stand up already. Siéntate. Kids start cracking up, right? But one thing that I did, and I was really just trying, I didn't know what I could do, was whenever I made reference sheets in math, and mind you, I teach eighth grade, y'all, eighth
Uh-huh.
grade math. So we're dealing with some algebraic concepts. We're dealing with some pretty complex stuff.
Yeah.
I actually, and I'm ashamed to say this, I went on Google Translate and it would translate my Google Doc into Spanish.
Uh-huh. But don't be ashamed, because so many people, we do it.
Yeah,
Right?
but I say that because I knew that it wasn't gonna be the most accurate
Perfect
translation,
translation for her. You felt it wasn't, like, yeah, fair to her.
but I also knew that I needed to find a way for her to access
Right.
the language. So then I was doing that, and then thankfully I had a few students who were bilingual. So I had a
Mhm.
student. His name is Habes. That was my man.
Uh-huh.
He volunteered. He was like, Mrs. Sarfo-Mensah, I can help with translation. So whenever I was teaching a lesson, he was translating the worksheets and what I was saying in
Yeah.
Spanish for her, and she was starting to understand it. But I felt bad because even though he voluntarily decided to help, I was taken away from his learning experience because he was starting to take on some of my labor.
But Kwame,
Do you see what I'm saying?
but I gotta interrupt you.
Okay.
It's funny perspectives. When I hear you say that, I admire what you did. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
Let's talk about the real world. In the real world, what you were teaching them is for us to work together for collaboration, and the teacher is not the end all be all. We are a family. I tell my students, we are a family here. Everyone in this room is going to help one another. We are going to find each other's strengths. I'm not the end all be all. I learn from you all, and you learn from me, and we learn from each other, and we make this happen. We have a goal for today. We have a goal for this lesson. Let's make it happen. We have to use each other's strengths to do that. And I think that you were actually teaching him, one, to use his strengths, and that it was giving that young gentleman confidence, right, to be a leader in that moment. I think that there's so much said to, because I see so many students in fear to even ask their teachers for them to chime in and get involved with other students and in something in that a situation like that. So I don't think shame on you at all. I think that that is the way education should happen, you know, and I think teachers feel too much pressure sometimes that we should be the end all be all. We're not.
Yeah, I appreciate you providing that perspective. I've never considered it in that light,
Mm,
because for me, I'm all about making sure that, yes, I want to empower my students to be leaders in their own right within this community.
mhm.
That's important to me, but at the same time, I want to make sure that they're still getting what they need.
Sure.
They're still getting, whatever rigor they need, whatever challenge they need
Sure.
academically to push themselves so they can get fed. So I
Right.
want to make sure everybody gets fed and
Right.
and they're stimulated in that way. But this is great because I think this is a perfect segue into just going into the bilingual mind, right?
Yes.
And I also want to get into this idea of translanguaging because I think everything that we talked about really speaks to that. So I know just from my own research and just talking to different people, I know when we talk about bilingualism, so often is this idea of is this binary thinking where okay, you have your native language. It doesn't have to be Spanish. It could be whatever language you speak.
Right.
And then there's English, right?
Right.
And it's like these two cannot exist on the same plane.
Mhm.
It's either one or the other, which is how
Mhm.
people look at bilingualism. But then when we talk about translanguage, it is more about these things can work hand in hand.
Yes.
And we can actually do some interchanging as we're doing our instruction, as we're thinking about our pedagogy,
Yes.
when addressing students. But I also wonder, given the fact that there's so much nuance when we talk about Spanish and how it's spoken, depending on what country
Mhm.
you're going to,
Mhm.
aren't there opportunities for translanguage in there? Where it's like, okay, I'm saying this, but I'm gonna switch it up for this other person and say it in the way that it's said in Spanish.
Yes.
So how do we incorporate all that within how do you do that within the different content areas you teach? Because you do that across different content areas within your bilingual classroom, which I think is impressive. How do you go about doing that?
I think number one thing is when you have to start off the year with your students and being just a culturally responsive educator. Your
Yes.
students have to know that you value their culture. They have to, and what does culture mean, right? So culture means their age, right? Their generation, their community,
Yes.
their, just their race, their language, their religion. I mean, culture means so many things. Your students have to know that their culture, that you know about their culture, you have to investigate what is their culture, what is their norms in their home. I do that actually, an activity that I do. I have my students interviewing their parents and they interview each other through a flip grid, and I get to watch all these videos and I can see how they interact with their families and what their questions are like and where their minds are at. I kind of study my families at the beginning of the year so I can really get to know them. I mean, this is recent I'm speaking of, like because of COVID and all those things and like the way the world is. That's
Right.
why we chose to do Flipgrid. It could be done in so many different other ways where when you get to know parents, I every conversation that you have, I like to call parents at the beginning of the year because I don't want our relationship to start with something happened and now your child's getting a consequence. No, I want a relationship to be built off of good. Hi, I'm just getting to know you. I'm your student's teacher. I like phone calls. Forget, I know we have all these apps. Guess what? That's nothing, that's not personable. Yes, use it later down the road, but every once in a while, you need to hear that person's voice and they need to hear your voice because you need to build relationships. But the
Right.
moment you build that relationship from the very beginning, you've got them. You have that level of respect from the students, from the parents. Okay, so we have this respect. We have this understanding of who we are, what our likes are, what our dislikes, what is acceptable in my culture, what's not acceptable in my culture. You know, it's my due diligence to research these things about my babies. Then So you're creating then a classroom environment. I think that your classroom environment, everything from your anchor charts, being available and accessible in all the language that is spoken into your classroom, or in my classrooms, it's predominantly Spanish and English. Whether it's like I told you the avocado word, if a student puts the word in avocado or palta, or they put in aguacate, I'm going to accept either one, right? If the students are creating the anchor charts. So what about the furniture in your classroom? I used to be that teacher that has my furniture in rows. Never again. We have flexible seating in my classroom.
Nice.
My students are allowed to stand up. They're allowed to sit on a beanbag. They're allowed to sit in a group, whatever. They want to sit individually by themselves and listen to some music while they work. That's acceptable too in my classroom. So the affective filter comes down. So I've created an environment personally how I feel comfortable with teaching, an environment where my students know that their classroom is their home. So what happens? You're in your home, you're comfortable. And when you're comfortable, you're going to express what you know, what you feel. And when you express what you really know, because nobody's going to put you down for that, you're really expressing everything that you know and you feel. And if there's debate later on opinions, that's okay too, but we need to do it with respect. So with that comes, naturally, that comes speaking in your native language, and the language that your whatever objective you're trying to hit. If it's going to be in English, we want our final product to be in English. Or maybe you're in a class. I teach native, or I used to teach native language arts for Spanish speakers. So it was a literature class, everything in Spanish. So there were kids that were raised here, but their parents speak Spanish, and but they're dominant. They're bilingual, but they're dominant for their expressive language when it comes to writing and and speaking had to be in English. But it had to be in Spanish, but they were stuck because their dominant part of that language was in English. But the class everything had to be produced in Spanish. So this is where translanguaging comes in. We talk about, you make your goals and your objectives very specific, and you're clear. 1, 2, 3, I need this from you. And then your students utilize all their resources, including each other, like you and I just talked about, the teacher, their friends. There's a lot of conversation happening. Their books, the internet, the anchor charts, to produce the final result in whatever language you want it to be.
Yes.
But all of that is acceptable. And I think that I like to add to this is that oftentimes we want to have assignments or projects to be done quickly. I need to get this done because we have a curriculum. It's okay if we slow down, because we got to look at the big picture. There's a lot involved with translanguaging in the classroom. It's a process. You're teaching collaboration, you're teaching listening skills. We don't do enough of, I feel like we're not doing enough of that. And we need to have patience through the process. So in a translanguaging classroom, you're going to be very clear about your objectives, have teacher clarity, and have students be clear on what their objectives are, number one. And then allow them to go through the process using whatever languages that they need, because like you said, use their whole language repertoire, whatever language it is. Do a draft. Have your draft in whichever language you like, but then your final product is going to be in the language that you need it to be in for whatever class it is. I know it's a long response from me, Kwame.
No, this is good. And this is important because there are teachers, particularly general education teachers, who need to know this. And just speaking from experience, when I was in the inclusion classroom, one of the requirements at my school was to not only have your learning standards, but also WIDA standards.
Yes. And good kudos to your school for doing that, because
Right.
a lot of schools aren't requiring that.
But I want to add to this too. So even though we were supposed to have WIDA standards on there, it felt very performative in a sense that, okay, we're gonna just put the poster up there with the different levels, 1 through 5. And then whenever our supervisor comes in for observations or our evaluations, then we really like have those WIDA standards there.
Uh-huh.
So, and it's something that's important. So I know in Massachusetts, I had to take classes on the SIOP model.
Yes.
So for those who don't know, SIOP is a sheltered immersion
Shelter,
uh,
nutrition, observation protocol.
observation protocol. I had to take classes on that for 2 months when I first got into
Yes.
teaching in Boston,
Yes.
and they were intense. But you learn so much about language and how it translates into your instruction.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, with WIDA and with any model, there's different levels of proficiency.
Yes.
So we talk about the emergent level. We talk about students who may be in the very beginning,
Hmm.
whether they're at level 1,
Right.
where they have maybe little to no English acquisition, all the
Hmm.
way through to 5, where it's like, okay,
Commanding.
they can definitely they could definitely be in this room with little to no support. Like
Hmm.
they'll be okay.
Hmm.
How are you able to do that differentiation in your instruction, knowing that you have bilingual learners at different levels of the spectrum in terms of their proficiency in English? How does that impact your planning of lessons?
That's such a great question. Key thing, like you just said, you have to plan. We can't do we
Can't
can't
wing this. You
we
can't
can't
wing
we
this.
can't wing it. I mean, I don't care how many years you've been a teacher. Which this will go into. I think you're gonna. You mentioned that you wanted to ask me what book I love right now. Seven Habits of Success of Highly Effective People, which brings me into you have to be a proactive individual. You can't be winging things.
Mhm.
Okay, we can't plan every single lesson for every single day if you're teaching more than one subject a day. It's the impossible. However, you do have to take the time to plan and really get to know your students, really know what level each student is at, and consistently and often us reassess them. I'm not talking about a big test. I'm talking about an exit ticket or a mini quiz or, you know, or sitting that an informal assessment where you're sitting with your students and checking to see where they're at. Okay. So because kids are growing, constantly growing, you need to know, like you were mentioning earlier, you need to know every one of your students' strengths. So I always, when I was planning for my students, I need to know, okay, this student is very outgoing and actually learns better when they are sharing out loud and repeating what they're learning. This is how this student learns. This student learns through art, right? So I'm considering their strengths. The students may be very shy, but they're going to be able to create me a diagram through art and label everything with the vocabulary that we're studying in the classroom. So I really pay attention to my students' strengths. I look at my language objective for my students. Um, I go through WIDA. You know, you go through WIDA and you look at what are the language proficiencies where they should be to hold my expectation for my students. The New York State Department of Education has a website that will tell you where should your students be based on the language proficiency and what you should be expecting from them depending on where they are with their proficiencies. And WIDA does all, as well. So if I know my student's an entering student, I'm not going to expect them to go up in front of the class and say a whole speech. But my student who's at proficiency level, I will expect them to do that. So you have to be, cognizant of those things. Or maybe my students who's entering, I maybe would have them speak in front of the class, but maybe they have sentence frames and I had to really practice with them before they went up to the class. I
Yeah.
scaffolded much more with that student.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of scaffolding. That's part of PSYOP involved with your students. You want to make them feel successful. You're clear with the expectation from them, but you're also acknowledging where they are. And, each individual child has their goals. And you also will conference with those students. Look, This is where you're at now. Where are we going to be in 6 months? Where are we going to be in 3 months for the next quarter? You're setting smart goals with them. I want to add something to this response and tie it in with one of the first questions that you asked me.
Yes.
How we all come from different parts of the world and different educational levels and getting to know our families.
Yes.
I might have a student who's entering and they just came to they're new to the country, but I learned that back at home, they went to an excellent school. They come from a very affluent family, and they have living with both parents. Both parents are here legally. Okay, that might be one situation. And yes, the student is entering, doesn't know a lick of English, doesn't know anything. Then I have a student that perhaps didn't even know their parent. They only had conversations with them. They were raised by their grandparents back in their home country. Their mother is illiterate, okay? And this student was working out on the street. Grandma could only do so much, and this student was struggling. This kid is a survivor, an observer, quick with it. And they're both entering. Okay, you have to see what their strengths are there. The first student I'm describing has that academic language in their native language. They're going to be probably a little quicker to learn the English because there's just a sense of translating. You're going to use cognates. And to be clear, cognates are words that sound the same and probably written very similarly in both English and in Spanish. So it makes it easier for that student to learn the language. And that student might be quicker to learn the language because they have that foundation. And then you might have the other student that, guess what? They have it tough at home, and they've had it tough. And it might take that student a little bit longer. So you need to have a little bit more patience, a little extra love. And I think all that ties in with what you asked me when you're planning. It's not just all academics. You have to look at the whole picture. So that's how I differentiate in my classroom. And guess what? I'm going to put all these students to work together when they're in the classroom, right? We're going to collaborate. We're going to work in groups. We're going to see who's going to help who. And that's how I worked with it. I would most definitely give my students their goals at their pace, but still have a high regard and high expectation for all of them to what they're capable of doing. Yeah.
All right. Appreciate that response. I appreciate that. And it has me thinking about this idea of inclusion. And I want to get your thoughts on this as far as how different school communities and different districts interpret what inclusion is. So when we think about special education as an example, we always are trying to put students with IEPs or 504s into their least restrictive environment, right? There's this idea of, okay, we're not going to emphasize the idea of having students in self-contained settings where they're not in the same learning communities as those who are, just for lack of a better term, in the mainstream, right?
Right.
I want to know what your thoughts are about inclusion within the context of bilingual learners. And I want to ask this because I know I've been in situations where I had students who are all across the spectrum in terms of their proficiency. And there were some who were supposed to get some pull-out services to help with their development. And then there's some who would just remain in the classroom the entire instructional period. But certain students weren't getting those services. And it led to them not getting the gains that they should have gained, that they should have had in terms of their proficiency. So I would just love to hear your thoughts on just inclusion in general within that context.
That's really a great question. because a lot of our students, and I see where you're going with this, and I see the issues and the concerns.
Yeah.
We have so many students that are no longer classified as an English language learner, right? An ESL student, but they're still being raised in a bilingual home.
Hmm.
So they're sometimes students, and depending on what they're learning. So maybe a student is, it's a very complicated question, because you might have a student, let's say, for example, I'm in a social studies class and I
Okay.
have no idea about the American Revolution, right? The way that they're teaching it to me. But, maybe the student has tons of knowledge in another subject area. The teacher is looking at them like the student is not proficient in English, but it could be that the student just didn't have enough exposure with that specific vocabulary, tier 3 vocabulary that you want them to know about. So we're for lack of better words, we're mislabeling this student, thinking, oh, this student's an ESL student, the student doesn't do well, the student doesn't know, um, and wanting to, and not knowing how to help them. So we have to, again, see where our students are and find creative ways to build their vocabulary and areas. Vocabulary is number one, in areas that they don't have exposure to. We have to give them exposure. And we have to acknowledge that just because the student is no longer an English language learner, they might have tested out, doesn't mean that they don't need the scaffolding and the supports
Thank you.
in the classroom. I think that's what you were going with and asking me.
Yes.
And we have to also view that our students are smart and they're bright. We just have to pull it out of them. And just because that they don't have enough knowledge in one area doesn't mean that they can't talk to you in that language that you want to speak in another area of topic of preference. So I think that scaffolding is huge. And we have to start with where they're at and see how we can break it down, the information, for them to better understand. And that goes back to lesson planning. We do have to when we take the time to lesson plan, it's a lot of work, but it pays off. It pays off.
It does, big time, big time. And what happens so often is we conflate a lack of English proficiency with the inability to perform academically, right? So just because the student is not proficient in English and they're not able to speak or write English, we automatically assume that they have learning challenges or they're not
Right,
able to perform well within these different content areas. So when you bring up RTI and you being an RTI interventionist, right?
right,
I'm sure you're telling your colleagues, hey, let's stay in tier 1. Let's do these interventions. What are you
right,
doing as far as accommodations are concerned? What have you done as a teacher?
right.
Because what happens so often is they're like, okay, I have a student here. Let's just take them right into tier 3. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What have you done
Yes. Oh,
in terms of
Kwame.
scaffolding and in terms of accommodations to ensure that
Oh,
this student has the access points?
yes. It is, and I put myself in the teacher's shoes when I once was not doing RTI. And
Mhm.
I was, because there's two ends of it. As a mother, I know you want to, when you see a student that really, really is struggling, and you probably foresee, like many students like do have learning disabilities, and like you see it. You hate
Yeah,
to go through the process because you feel like you're wasting time, right? And
you're right.
so, but then there are students who just need that time. It's not that they have a learning disability. They just need the time. And teachers, we need to do all the scaffolding for them and be consistent with the interventions to allow them to show the growth. We can't just be like, oh, I taught it to you. We did that for 2 days. You should know it by now. No, because everyone learns at a different with different modalities, different pace. Um, Maybe that you presented information to the student doesn't mean that they learned it, right? So we have to keep aware of that it's constantly bringing things back and making connections with the students know and what you're teaching them, and knowing that presenting information to our students in either language or both languages, however we expose it to them, has to be done in different modalities. It can't be right now. We're doing a lot of just comprehensible input, showing videos, giving them the app, showing videos, giving them the app. But are we allowing students enough time, equal amount of time for the expressive language?
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing a lot of us not allowing for that academic discussion to share what we know and or expressing themselves with things outside of essays. Like,
Right.
our students can show all that they know in so many ways. I have a student that she's actually not my student. She's from another classroom, but I had some interactions with her. She's highly under the spectrum. But as she was taking the ELA state test, she was drawing, and her art fascinated me. And she wasn't talking. She just doesn't. The teacher told me she doesn't like to talk. She's almost like a selective mute. But guess what? When I talked to her about making a mural on a wall in my building, she loved that idea. And guess what? This baby started talking to me. First, we started drawing, and we started to share the vision and the concept to connect with our school's mission. And she had a lot to say.
Mm.
So we have to again build on our students, see where they are, and then how can we scaffold and how can we build on what they know for them to open up, and to share what they know. So it's not going to always be done through an essay. It's not going to always be done even orally. And sometimes we need to give them time to digest what they're learning. We need to give them time for that receptive language to process what they're learning, to make connections later out on the playground, or to make connections when they go have the opportunity to a museum with their parents and be like, oh yeah, I learned that at school. So things cannot always be instant.
Yeah, I mean, and you're just speaking on this idea of the worship of the written word. So, if for those who are familiar with the characteristics of white supremacy culture, there's conversation around this idea of if you're not able to showcase or demonstrate your intelligence or what you know verbally and just through the written word, then it's like you don't understand what's going on. So just having to debunk that theory is something that takes work.
Mhm.
Um, I do have a couple more questions before we start to close out, and this has been a great conversation. And honestly, we could talk
We can
forever.
talk.
Um, I want to circle back to the beginning where you were talking about your Cuban and Peruvian heritage and just growing up at home, but also through your K to 12 years. And I want you to think back to how you were able to navigate those years in K to 12, and also think about your students when I pose this question. And I understanding that you have students from different um, Spanish speaking or Latin American countries, right?
Mhm.
What do you believe are the main issues and challenges that they face within the K-12 school system? And you could take it at any angle, whether it's curricular, whether it's just interactional, cultural, however you want to slice it and dice it.
Lordy, Lord, what a question.
I know we're just gonna be scratching the surface.
I
So
know. Okay. I think we've been talking about it basically this entire time.
yeah,
That we need to look at our whole child. We need to look at our entire families. We need to consider every aspect, and then remember that every student has a purpose and has a talent. Most recently, I created an amazing event at my school. We converted our school to a conference day, what we called EMS talks.
Yep.
And we had 46 different presenters from the community come share with our students about not their career, their why and their purpose and their journey and their failures. I think that in the school system, we're so caught up with checking off boxes of everything we have to meet in our curriculum that we're forgetting to have our students understand there is a why and a purpose for all the skills that we're trying to teach you. And if we don't express that to our babies, they're not gonna, and we don't help them find their talents and find their why and acknowledge their talents and acknowledge their why, they're not going to care about the worksheet that you're putting in front of them or the activity that you're putting in front of them.
Yes.
Especially as they get older. So I think that our kids need to see the end result, and that I have to add this, like working with entering students. I have some of my students who are are not residents of the country, not citizens. I had a student just visit me, was once my 6th grader, now is going into her senior year. Her dream has always been to be an FBI agent.
Wow.
I adore her. She's just awesome. She's so intelligent, and I always have motivated her, and I've always sent her things she can participate in here and to get involved and to prepare her for that day she wants to apply to be an FBI agent. But how sad that I never considered the fact that it's possible that she doesn't even have her residency to even apply for that. And she finally opened up to me. She came back to visit me and she shared to me, Ms. Roman, I went through the process. Long story short, the lawyer had personal issues, lost his license to be a lawyer. My case went downhill. We have to start all over. I don't even know if I'm going to get my residency. She's already been here for 8 years. So this baby's dealing with this. And here I am like, okay, you're going to be an FBI agent. You can do it. But then now we have to reroute her. How's she going to do this? So why am I mentioning this to you is because her why and her purpose and her journey is not as easy as we think it is. So when she's sitting in school and her teacher is expecting her to do this essay, you can't just say, oh, because you got to go to college. Aren't you going to go to college? And you have to be a professional. To her, that doesn't really apply.
Right.
So we have to know our kids' stories. And we have to think about their final long-term SMART goal. And we have to know that goes back to being culturally responsive teacher. We have to know our kids and their families and their situations. So I think that if you ask me, our kids just are not a number, and it's just not about giving tests. We have to expose them to the world, and we have to expose them that it's not just college. Our world is changing. We have to prepare them for this Instagram, LinkedIn world. You look at you, Kwame, what you're doing now is you're outside of the box, and it's, beyond 21st century, if you ask me. And do our students prepared for that? So
listen, and this is just PD in podcast form, honestly.
It is.
It's PD. It's PD. These are things that you probably wouldn't hear in your average PD session after school, right? Minus all the slides and all the extra stuff, right?
Right.
Like this is what it is.
This is the real.
Yes. So Lizette, we have to talk about educating with love before we get to this lightning round. So I want to give you a chance to talk to us about what inspired you to start educating with love, and what is the overarching mission of educating with love? So talk to us.
Educating with love, I think, just all started with everything that I expressed with you today. If we all are better listeners, really listen. Don't have your agenda behind the conversation. Really listen to the other person, and you demonstrate love. We will have a better understanding, and we can work together. So my greater mission is for teachers, to help support teachers, educating them. What does the research say? But then when we are going to be going back to the classroom, we educate our students and our families and our colleagues with love. Um, and so it's about, I provide consulting. So I'm a consultant. My consulting is all revolved around teaching the SIOP model, bringing an awareness about bilingual education, being a culturally responsive educator. And so in the future, Educating with Love is working on creating the platform for us to get together once a month. And I am working on that, and to be able to provide more PD. So really just a resource. People are welcome to reach out to me and, for any kind of consultation.
There it is, y'all. So make sure you all reach out to Lizette to learn more about Educating with Love. It is a great platform that just continues to grow. I can remember 2 years ago when you were still building it and where it is now. So I mean, I can attest to the growth of the platform and where it's continuing to go. So make sure y'all check it out.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to share and share ideas.
Yes. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us. But yes, we do have to do this quick lightning round. Just a couple of questions that I think are important because we've been talking about some heavy subjects. So I want to definitely keep it light. First thing is, what are you doing for self-care? How do you maintain your sanity through all this?
I love to dance, and I've been trying to work out, do my 5 a.m.s Orange Theory. Yes.
Awesome. And if you can invite three influential figures, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be?
Okay, Kwame, I feel so bad. I didn't prepare for that
It's
question.
all good. We're gonna
There
wing
are
it. We said we're gonna
so,
wing it, right?
oh my gosh.
We'll get some wait time.
Yeah, there are so many people who I would invite. Ofelia Garcia, who's like the
Mm,
guru in our world of translanguaging.
yes.
There's just so many people. Let's just leave it at Ofelia Garcia to start off. I know that's not as exciting as I would love because there's so many
Oh,
people.
it's all good. Ophelia Garcia's she pretty much can make up for all three.
Yeah.
That's just how powerful she is. Just personally being able to learn more about her work.
Yes. And she's Cuban. Okay. So,
Yes, and wishing that I had come across her work when I was still in the classroom. That would have been extremely helpful.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
I know now.
It started. Me too when I first started for sure.
Yes. All right, friend. So thank you again. We'll definitely be in touch,
Like always.
and I hope people do reach out and connect with you because you provide a lot to this platform. You have so much to offer, especially when we talk about language development and why it's important in our schools, and we don't talk about it enough.
No, no, we don't. But we will. Well, that's our mission. Thank you, Kwame, for having me.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye. All right, y'all. So we're about to end another episode of I Dang Talk with Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.